The box was cardboard, medium-sized, the kind you get from a liquor store when you need to carry something and don't have time to think about the container. It held my coffee mug, the blue one with the chipped handle I'd had since my sophomore year of college, the one that had survived 4 apartments and 2 cross-country moves, and which I had never once considered replacing because it held exactly the right amount of coffee and fit exactly right in my hand. My winter robe, the gray one. A photograph of my mother in a frame I had bought at a flea market when I was 24. A phone charger. 3 books from the nightstand. A novel I was midway through. A collection of essays. A thin volume of poetry my father had given me 2 Christmases ago. And at the top, resting on everything else like a deliberate placement, a greeting card I had made by hand for Daniel's birthday 4 years ago, which I had found once in his desk drawer when I was looking for a pen, and which I had thought, at the time, meant something. His mother had carried the box herself. She had walked up my porch steps with it held in both hands and set it down at my feet with the specific deliberateness of a woman who has been looking forward to a gesture for a long time. She straightened up. She smoothed the front of her coat. She looked at me with an expression I had spent 12 years trying to read correctly and which I now understood with complete clarity for the first time. "I think this is cleaner," she said. "Quick is better, like pulling off a bandage." Daniel was standing 3 feet behind her. He was in the doorway of my house. My house, the house that was titled in my name only, a fact that Roberta did not appear to have fully researched. And he was looking at the porch floor. Not at me, not at his mother. At the floor, the specific downward angle of a man who has made a decision he cannot currently look at directly. I want to tell you that I had something ready. That 12 years of marriage and 8 months of driving 3 hours alone to sit with my dying father had left me with some precisely calibrated phrase. Something cold and accurate that would have served as both response and verdict. I didn't have anything ready. I had been awake for 44 hours. I had buried my father 2 days ago. I was standing on my own porch at 8 o'clock in the morning in the clothes I had slept in, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared at nothing, and the woman who had called me dear for 12 years, in a way that was never quite warm enough, was handing me a liquor store box containing my own belongings. I looked at the box. I looked at the greeting card on top. I looked at Daniel's bowed head. I picked up the box. I went inside. I closed the door, and I made a phone call that neither of them anticipated because they had both made the same fundamental miscalculation. They had confused my grief with my incapacity. They were about to learn the difference. Let me tell you about my father first, because this story does not make sense without him. His name was Richard. He was 68 years old when he died, which is not old enough. I want to say that plainly, because people sometimes receive the death of a parent with a kind of resigned acceptance when the parent has reached a certain age, as if longevity makes loss smaller. It doesn't. My father was 68, and he had retired 2 years earlier from 35 years as a civil engineer, and he had been learning to paint watercolors, badly and enthusiastically, and he had a garden that he tended with the same methodical precision he had brought to every structure he had ever built. He called me every Sunday at noon. He had not missed a single Sunday call in 11 years. The week before he died, when speaking was difficult, he had his nurse hold the phone to his ear for the call, and I had talked and he had listened, and at the end, he had managed to say, clearly enough that I heard it without question, "You are going to be fine, Rachel. I mean that specifically. You." He said specifically because he knew me. He knew that I would need the specificity, that a general assurance would not hold the weight I needed it to hold. He had known me for 36 years, and he knew exactly how my mind worked, and he gave me the word I needed in the last conversation we had. That was my father. That was the man I had buried 2 days before Roberta arrived on my porch with a liquor store box. He had been sick for 8 months. The diagnosis came in February. Aggressive, the oncologist said, which is a word that sounds active, almost athletic, and which means in practice that you do not have the luxury of the timeline you thought you had. I had taken family medical leave from my job at the architecture firm where I worked as a senior project manager, and I had spent those 8 months in a rhythm of driving 3 hours south to the family home in Virginia where my father lived with the housekeeper named Gloria, who had been with him for 6 years and who I will love for the rest of my life. 3 hours back to the city where Daniel and I had our house. I made that drive so many times in those 8 months that I stopped counting somewhere around the 30th time. I knew every rest stop. I knew the specific quality of light on the highway at 6 in the morning and at 11 at night and at 2 in the afternoon in late summer when the heat makes the asphalt look liquid. Daniel had come with me 4 times in 8 months. 4 times. I had stopped asking after the 6th refusal because the asking had started to cost me more than the absence, and I needed to conserve what I had. He was busy. His firm was in the middle of a large commercial real estate transaction. I understood this. I had made myself understand it with the specific, deliberate work of a person who does not want to look directly at something because looking at it will require action she does not currently have the capacity for. I understood it the way you understand something you have chosen to put down temporarily, telling yourself you will pick it up again when you have room for it. I had room for it now. I had a great deal of room for it. My father died on a Tuesday morning at 6:47. I was holding his left hand. My sister Mara was holding his right. Gloria was in the doorway. The hospice nurse, a steady, quiet woman named Philippa, who I have thought about often since, said what needed to be said and gave us what we needed and left us alone with him for an hour, which was the right thing to do, and which I will always be grateful for. I called Daniel from the parking lot at 8:15. He answered on the 4th ring. His voice had the particular quality of someone who has been awake for a while and is managing their tone carefully. I told him. He said the right things. "I'm so sorry. Are you okay? I love you. Take all the time you need." He said he would try to come for the funeral. He asked if Mara was with me. He said he would call back in an hour. He called back in 2 hours. The deal was at a critical stage. He was devastated not to be there. He would be there to pick me up on Friday. He was so sorry. He did not come to my father's funeral. He sent flowers, white lilies, in a tall arrangement, with a card that said, "With deepest sympathy, Daniel." The florist had clearly written it. I stood next to those flowers during the reception after the service and thought about his handwriting, which I knew as well as my own, which was not on that card. Mara stood beside me for most of that afternoon, saying nothing about Daniel's absence, because she knew me well enough to know I wasn't ready to talk about it, and because she was in her own grief, and we were both just trying to hold the shape of the day. At one point, she handed me a glass of water and squeezed my arm and said very quietly, "He should be here." And I said, "I know," and we stood there together, and that was all that needed to be said between us. Daniel picked me up on Friday as promised. He was attentive on the drive home, hand on mine for part of the journey, asking careful questions, saying the right things in the right register. I was tired in the deep, specific way of someone who has been running on managed adrenaline for 8 months and has now run out of runway. I answered his questions and leaned against the window and watched the highway unreal and felt, underneath the exhaustion, the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. A question forming itself in the back of my mind. A question I was not yet ready to articulate because articulating it would require acting on the answer. We had dinner at home. Daniel had ordered from the Italian place we liked and set the table properly and lit a candle, which under other circumstances would have felt like care, and which that evening felt like something I needed to think about later. I ate and said the appropriate things and went to bed at 9 o'clock and was asleep before 9:30. Saturday morning, I slept until 9. The house was quiet when I came downstairs. Daniel's car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in the kitchen or the living room. I made coffee. The blue mug. The one with the chipped handle. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, which needed attention. The last of the fall leaves still down. the garden beds not yet put to bed for winter. My father would have had his garden sorted by the second week of October. He was methodical about it. I heard the guest room door close. I stood very still. I held the blue mug in both hands, and I did not move, and I let the sound finish registering. We did not use the guest room. There was no plausible reason for Daniel to be in the guest room at 9 on a Saturday morning. The guest room was where we put suitcases. The guest room door had no reason to close. I set the mug down. I walked down the hallway. I stood outside the guest room door. From the other side came the specific silence of a person who has stopped moving because they have heard someone approach. Not the silence of an empty room, but the active, attended silence of someone waiting. I knocked twice. Yeah, 1 second. 30 seconds. I counted. Then the door opened and Daniel came out with his phone in his hand and a mildly distracted expression that I recognized as rehearsed, because I had been watching his expressions for 12 years and I knew which ones were real and which ones were managed. "Morning," he said. "Didn't want to wake you. Work call. On a Saturday. The deal." He shrugged, the practiced shrug of someone who has used this explanation many times and has it down. "Critical stage. You know how it is." I looked at him. I looked at the phone in his hand. His standard personal phone, the one I knew, the one whose case I recognized. I thought about the guest room door. I thought about 30 seconds. "Sure," I said. "Coffee's ready." I went back to the kitchen. I refilled my mug. I sat down and I thought, with the particular precision I bring to complex problems at work. The inventory of what I knew, what I suspected, what the gap between those two things implied. I was a senior project manager at an architecture firm. My job, in its most fundamental form, was to understand systems, how they were built, where they were vulnerable, what the failure points were, and how to address those failure points before they became failures. I was professionally trained to see problems with structural clarity. I had spent 8 months not applying this skill to my marriage because I did not have room for what the application would reveal. I had room now. My father had died on Tuesday, and I had buried him on Thursday, and it was Saturday morning, and I had room. The question forming in the back of my mind had a name now. I didn't like the name. I looked at it anyway. I found the second phone on Sunday morning. I was not looking for it. I want to be precise about this, because the how matters. I was looking for the car keys. We kept miscellaneous items in the kitchen drawer to the left of the stove. Batteries, takeout menus, a small screwdriver, twist ties, the accumulated small hardware of a shared domestic life conducted over many years. Daniel sometimes left his keys there. I opened the drawer. The keys were not in the drawer. What was in the drawer, at the back, under a folded paper grocery bag, was a phone in a case I did not recognize. Different carrier, different model, different case. A black rubberized case, utilitarian, chosen to be unremarkable. I stood at the open drawer and looked at the phone. I looked at it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 15 seconds. Then I put the grocery bag back over it exactly as it had been. I closed the drawer. I found the car keys on the counter, where they had been the whole time. I went to the living room and sat down on the couch. Daniel was in the shower. I could hear the water running. The bathroom was down the hall, and in our house you could hear the pipes when the shower was on, a low hum that had been part of the background of our domestic life for 8 years. I sat and I listened to the pipes, and I thought about what to do with what I had just found. What I felt was not the sharp devastation you might expect. That came later, in waves, at unpredictable moments, for months afterward. What I felt in that moment was something more like the particular sensation of a fog lifting. The sudden, complete legibility of terrain I had been moving through for a long time, with a map that was simply wrong. The shower stopped. I heard the bathroom door open. I heard Daniel moving through the bedroom, the soft, specific sounds of someone getting dressed. I sat on the couch and held still. "You're up," he said, coming into the living room. He was in jeans and a gray sweater, and he looked comfortable and ordinary, and he smiled when he saw me. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine," I said. "I'm going to call Carolyn today. Is that okay?" "Of course." The smile, maintained, slightly warmed to indicate approval. "You should. She'll be good for you." "I think so too," I said. I called Carolyn from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house. I told her everything: the guest room, the second phone, the funeral, the 8 months. I told it in order, without editorializing. When I finished, Carolyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not touch that phone again. Do not say a word to Daniel. I'm sending you a name right now. Call her today. Margaret Howell. Family law attorney. 14th floor, Riverview. Bookshelves in alphabetical order by subject." I called her from the parking lot and left a message. She called back within the hour. I had an appointment for Monday morning. Margaret Howell's first question, after I had laid out everything I knew, was not about the second phone or the guest room. It was about the house. "The title," she said. "Who's on it?" "Only me. We bought it before we got married. I keep meaning to add Daniel to the deed, but we never got around to the paperwork." She made a note. She had a legal pad and a precise, unhurried handwriting. She wrote things down while looking at you, which I found I trusted. "Second question," she said. "Financial accounts. What do you have joint visibility into, and what is he managing independently?" I walked her through it. Joint checking for household expenses. We both had access, both received statements. My personal savings account in my name only. Daniel's primary personal account, which I had some awareness of through tax documents and occasional conversations. His investment portfolio, which he described to me in quarterly summaries that he prepared himself on his laptop, and which I had always received as reports rather than documents I had independent access to. Margaret Howell set her pen down. "The quarterly summaries he prepares himself. Do you have copies?" "I have a few. He usually shows me the screen. I have maybe 3 printed copies from over the years." "Bring me every financial document you have access to," she said. "Tax returns, joint statements, anything with both names or his name. I'm going to bring in a forensic accountant I work with. Her name is Susan Park. She's very good, and I want her to have everything she needs to build a complete picture." "How long will that take?" 2 weeks for a preliminary assessment, less if the picture is straightforward." She also asked about the property title, as I said, and told me she would verify its status and place a protective notation, a flag that would require additional scrutiny on any pending transfer. I did not know then why she was thinking about transfers. I understood later. I spent that evening pulling every financial document I could access. Tax returns going back 7 years, in a folder in my home office. I kept them meticulously, filed by year, because I was a project manager, and this was simply how I lived. Joint checking statements, which I downloaded from the bank portal in one continuous sitting. The printed quarterly summaries I could find, 3 from the past 4 years, in a file drawer. Property tax statements, insurance documents, everything. I brought it to Margaret Howell's office the next morning in a banker's box. She looked at the box with the expression of a person who appreciated thoroughness, which is how I knew we were going to work well together. While I waited for Susan Park's preliminary report, I went back to work. This was not because I was finished grieving my father. I was nowhere near finished, and I am not entirely finished even now. But I had learned from watching my father work through difficulty that occupation is not avoidance. That doing the thing in front of you with your full attention is not the same as pretending the other thing isn't there. My father had been a civil engineer who had gone to work 3 days after his own father died. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he believed that the structure of a regular day was itself a form of care. I believed the same thing. I went back to work. I managed 2 large projects that fall: a mixed-use residential development in the East District and a renovation of a historic building downtown. I managed them from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and I came home and made dinner, and talked to Daniel about ordinary things and went to bed. And I did not once indicate by any word or gesture or expression that anything had changed since Sunday morning in the kitchen drawer. I discovered, remarkably good at this. The same capacity for compartmentalization that had allowed me to manage 8 months of driving and grief and work simultaneously now served a different purpose, and I inhabited it with a precision that I recognized, during quiet moments, as having been inherited directly from the man I had buried. Daniel, for his part, was attentive in the way of someone who has made a decision and is managing the interim period before its consequences arrive. He brought me coffee in the mornings. He asked about my projects. He was present at dinner in a way he had not been for some time, which I understood now as the particular attentiveness of guilt rather than love, though from the outside, the two are indistinguishable. I accepted the coffee and answered the questions and noted everything, the way my father had taught me to note things, specifically, without interpretation, as data. Susan Park's preliminary report arrived 12 days after I had brought the banker's box to Margaret's office. I read it at Margaret's conference table, with Margaret present and Susan Park on a video call from her office, explaining what she had found. The report was 16 pages, and it was organized with the specific clarity of someone who understood that the person reading it needed to hold a complex picture without losing the thread. I held the thread. The joint checking account. 19 transfers over 14 months, ranging from $400 to $2,200, categorized in the account as household expense, with no corresponding identified expense. Total, $19,400. Destination, a personal account at a separate bank not previously identified. The account number traced, through bank routing documentation, to a personal account in Daniel's name at a regional bank we had no other relationship with. The investment portfolio, the quarterly summaries Daniel had prepared, showed values that, when compared against the actual investment account statements Susan Park had obtained through the discovery process, reflected selective reporting. The portfolio had been described to me over the years at a combined value approximately 35% higher than its documented current value. A portion of this discrepancy was attributable to market performance. A larger portion was attributable to transfers out of the portfolio that had not been disclosed in any summary. Susan Park had traced these transfers to a brokerage account in Daniel's name only, opened 6 years into our marriage. The brokerage account currently held $87,000. The separate bank account, the one receiving the joint checking transfers, held $23,000. Total undisclosed assets, $110,000, plus whatever he had spent from these accounts over time, which Susan Park was still working to document, but estimated conservatively at an additional $30,000 to $40,000. I sat at the conference table and read those numbers and thought about the quarterly summaries. The laptop screen turned toward me. Daniel's voice, measured and informative, explaining the state of their financial life. Me, nodding, asking a question or two, accepting the report. 12 years. Margaret Howell let me have the silence I needed. Susan Park, on the video call, waited. After a long moment, I looked up and said, "What about the second phone?" Margaret said, "We don't have legal access to its contents at this stage, but what we have here is sufficient. The undisclosed assets, the pattern of transfers, the independent accounts. This is the picture we need for the dissolution proceedings." How does the house factor in? The house is in your name only, premarital acquisition. It is not part of the marital estate subject to division. She paused. Which is, I suspect, why certain other steps may have been contemplated. I looked at her. What steps? She opened a different folder. The protective notation I placed on your title 18 days ago was in response to something Susan found in the county recorder database during her research. There was a pending inquiry on your property, not a filing, just a records pull, originating from an attorney named Bruce Deller. He handles residential real estate transfers. The inquiry was made approximately 10 days before you came to see me. I said nothing. I thought about the guest room, the 30 seconds before the door opened. Someone was looking at the title, I said. Someone was researching what would be required to move it. I sat with that for a long moment. And the protective notation means any transfer attempt on that property now triggers an automatic review. They would know immediately that someone is watching. I thought about Roberta. Her arrival at 8 in the morning with a liquor store box. The timing of it. 2 days after the funeral, a Sunday, the assumption of a woman in extremis, exhausted, grief-struck, not yet resourced. I thought about what the box was actually for. Not cruelty, though it was that. It was a test. She had come to see whether I would simply leave. If I had simply left, packed more things, gone to stay with Mara, vacated the house in the fog of grief, the house would have been empty. And an empty house is easier to deal with than an occupied one in certain transactions. I thought about Daniel looking at the floor. "When can we file?" I said. Margaret Howell filed the dissolution petition on a Wednesday morning. Daniel was served at his office, which Margaret had recommended as a matter of record. Cleaner documentation of receipt. He called me 40 minutes after the process server left his building. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 6 sentences long. 3 of them began with I. None of them contained an apology. I called him back from my car at lunch. The conversation was 14 minutes, and I am not going to reproduce it here because it belongs to the private geography I mentioned earlier, the part of a story that is real and human and not for the record. What I will say is that he confirmed, in the elliptical way of someone who cannot yet bring himself to full directness, what Susan Park's report had shown. He said he had been planning to tell me. He said it had gotten complicated. He said he was sorry things had come to this. I said, "I need you to vacate the house by end of week." A pause. "Rachel, the house is in my name. You have no legal basis to remain. Margaret has sent documentation of the formal request to your attorney. Please be out by Friday at 6. Another pause, longer. Then, "Okay." He was gone by Thursday afternoon. The mediation process took 4 months. I want to be honest about those 4 months because the stories we tell about this kind of thing tend to collapse the difficult parts into a single sentence. It was hard. And then move on to the resolution. And I think that does a disservice to what it actually costs. Those 4 months were the most sustained, difficult experience of my adult life, including the 8 months of driving. The grief was a different texture. Not the clean, terrible grief of losing someone you loved without complication, but the ragged, recursive grief of losing something that you now had to revise your entire understanding of. I was not only losing a marriage, I was losing the version of the last 12 years I had believed in, which meant that every memory required re-examination, and there is no word in English adequate to describe how exhausting that is. I worked. I managed the East District development and the historic building renovation. I drove to Virginia twice to spend time with Mara and to sit with my father's garden, which she and Gloria were maintaining with a faithfulness that moved me every time. I had dinner with Carolyn and with my colleague Diane from work, and once, memorably, with Priya, the property attorney who had, through a professional coincidence she described with characteristic understatement as just timing, mentioned the title pull to me in the first place. Over that dinner, I learned that Priya had noticed the inquiry in the course of reviewing a different transaction at the county recorder's office and had simply known, in the way that good attorneys know things, that I would want to be aware of it. She had not been obligated to tell me. She had told me anyway. "Did you know what was happening?" I asked her. "I knew something was," she said. "I didn't know the specifics." "Why tell me?" She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. "Because you had just buried your father," she said. "And because sometimes the right thing is just the right thing." I thought about that for a long time afterward. About the chains of small decisions that add up to outcomes. About Carolyn answering her phone on a Sunday afternoon and giving me Margaret's name. About Margaret placing a protective notation on a title as a matter of standard practice, not because she had specific intelligence, but because it was the right precaution. About Priya, in a county recorder's database on an ordinary Tuesday, connecting two dots she had no professional obligation to connect and making one phone call. About my father. You are going to be fine, Rachel. I mean that specifically. You. He had known. Not the specifics. He couldn't have known the specifics. But he had known me, and he had known the shape of what I could handle, and he had said the specific thing that I needed in the last conversation we had, because he understood that I would come to a moment where I needed to remember it. I remembered it. The mediation concluded in February. The dissolved marital estate included the undisclosed brokerage account, $87,000 subject to division, the separate bank account, and the remaining documented transfers calculated against their current value with interest. Susan Park's final report, which expanded on her preliminary findings, had identified an additional $26,000 in transactions over a longer time frame than the initial 14-month window, bringing the total documented undisclosed sum to $136,000. The house was not part of the mediation. The house had never been part of the mediation. The house was mine. One item was specifically addressed in the final agreement, at my request. The inquiry on my property title, the records pulled by Bruce Deller's office that had preceded my first meeting with Margaret by 10 days, was formally documented as evidence of pre-dissolution asset movement planning. Margaret had recommended including it because, as she said, documentation of intent matters in family law the way documentation of intent matters in any system where outcomes can be contested later. I had agreed immediately because I was my father's daughter, and I believed in keeping records. I signed the final documents on a Wednesday morning in a conference room with a view of the river, which was the same view as Margaret Howell's office, and which I looked at for a long moment after I had put down the pen. The river was doing what rivers do in February, moving steadily, without drama, going exactly where it was going. I found this appropriate. I drove home through the city. Early morning, light thin and clear, the kind of February light that is honest rather than kind. I turned onto my street and saw my house from the end of the block, the craftsman details, the porch where I had stood with the liquor store box 4 months ago, the garden that needed its spring attention. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a minute. Then I got out and went inside. I spent that Saturday in the garden. I cut back what needed cutting. I turned the soil in the front bed where the tulips would come up in March. I cleared the last of the fall debris that had been waiting patiently through winter for attention. My father had taught me to garden in the same methodical way he had taught me everything, patiently, with attention to what the ground needed, rather than what you wanted to do to it. He had a saying, "The garden will tell you what it needs if you pay attention." He said this about gardens. He meant it about most things. I paid attention. By 4 o'clock, the garden was in order. I went inside and made tea. The tea Daniel had never liked, the kind my father drank, a strong breakfast blend that could hold milk. And I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at what I had done. The beds were clean. The ground was turned. Things would grow. Mara called at 5. I told her about the final agreement. She made the sound she makes when something has been resolved that needed resolving. Not exactly relief, more like the settling of something that had been held at a slight angle for a long time and is now correctly placed. She asked about the house. I told her I was keeping it. She said good. She said Dad's roses, the ones she had been tending in Virginia, had been overwintered well and would be something this spring. I said I was glad. We talked for an hour, and it was the easiest hour I had had in a long time. After we hung up, I sat with the empty tea mug in my hands. The blue mug was on the shelf above the coffee maker, where it always was. I had put it back the day I brought the liquor store box inside, emptied the box, put every single item back exactly where it belonged, and recycled the box in the bin by the back door. The greeting card I had made by hand had gone in the recycling too, without ceremony, because it had already told me everything it had to tell, and what it had told me was that some things you make with care get used in ways you never intended, and that is information worth having. I washed out the tea mug. I set it in the drying rack. I looked at the kitchen, my kitchen, the specific kitchen of a specific house that I had loved on sight and bid on at a number that had made me slightly sick and had been right about, continuously, for 8 years. My phone was on the table. I picked it up. I looked at my father's name in the contacts. Sunday at noon, for 11 years, never missed. I did not call. I sat with it for a long moment, the specific weight of that absence. Then I put the phone down and picked up the tea kettle and put it on for another cup. The house was quiet around me. Not the held breath quiet of the previous months. Not the loud quiet of something wrong. Just the easy, specific quiet of a house that is itself, that holds its structure without effort, because the structure is correct. Outside, the February light was going down behind the fence. The garden waited in the dusk, turned and tended, ready for what would come next. I made my tea. I sat at the table. I thought about my father in his garden in October, cutting back the roses before winter. Neat, methodical, exactly right. I thought about the way he had held my hand and said specifically. I thought about Carolyn and Margaret and Susan Park and Priya and the chain of small correct decisions that had brought me to this kitchen on this evening. I thought. I paid attention. The tea was hot. The house was mine. Spring was coming. I drank my tea and let that be enough, because it was.